Hi, and welcome to S for Science, and this video is at 30 FPS, 30 frames or images per second. You're seeing 30 images per second, but as they happen so fast, it gives the illusion of seeing something in motion. For this reason, the YouTube videos that are at 60 FPS look more fluid. But where's the limit? With how many FPS does the human eye work? Well, it depends on the person. The average is 45 FPS. That means that for many people, the videos at 60 FPS look better than they can appreciate. There's information left. Approximately 25% of the population can appreciate those 60 FPS, and it is due to this limitation of images that we sometimes see how the wheels of the cars seem to go backwards. Surely you have seen that if a wheel speeds up its rotation, there comes a moment where it begins to seem to rotate more slowly until it stops and it begins to rotate in the opposite direction. Because the brain is not capable of processing so many images, and due to a certain frequency of rotation that is different in each person, the brain sees what it can, and this effect occurs. Although there are people that can see much more. Studies carried out on military pilots have shown that in some extreme cases, these people can see 220 FPS. This is because they have trained their brain to be able to appreciate the extremely fast important details that occur when flying in an airplane. Indeed, this is a skill that can be trained within the limits imposed by our biology. And sorry if I disappointed you, but you have to accept that you don't have a continuous perception of reality. They are continuous photos joined together by your brain, although I would consider it something good in terms of memory reserves, taking into account the resolution with which our eyes capture the world. It could be said that we capture the world with 8 megapixels. This is the number that you get when you take into account our field of view, the types of receptors that we have in our eyes, and the density with which they are distributed throughout our retina. Our eyes cannot be directly compared with a camera. We have a very regular and heterogeneous view. For example, in each one of your eyes, there is a small area called fovea that corresponds exactly with the center of your field of view and contains approximately half of all the receptors that are in your eyes. The area of the fovea is tiny, about the size of your two thumbs together when you stretch your arms. And 50% of your vision is concentrated in this tiny point. Something very curious about the fovea is that it contains cones, but no rods. Let's remember that cones are the cells in charge of perceiving light when it is abundant, while the rods, on the contrary, are those cells that allow us to see in dark conditions. For evolutionary reasons, the cones are much more important to us, since we are diurnal animals, which is why they are so abundant in the fovea, the most important part of our field of view. Let me tell you an anecdote. In October 2005, there was a partial eclipse of the sun in Europe. And the foolish 10-year-old me, no matter how many times his teachers told him to not look directly to the sun, did. Don't look at solar eclipses without protective glasses. However, it fascinated me to see how the sun was covered by a giant piece of rock floating in outer space. But then I started to feel regret. Maybe I had permanently damaged my eyesight. But after a professional self-diagnosis carried out by a 10-year-old boy, I could verify that the exposure had been too short for it to have inflicted any damage on my retina. Or so I thought. Time passed. One day I went out to the terrace of my house to observe the firmament, and I got scared again, because I realized that if I fixed my vision on the less bright stars of the firmament, I couldn't see them. I knew that they were there because I could see them with my peripheral vision, but when I looked directly at them, they would disappear. It was obvious why this was happening. I remembered the eclipse. I had damaged my retina. And the 10-year-old me grew up lamenting the thought that he had lost his vision and always wearing glasses when watching eclipses. Until one day I learned the morphology of human retinas, and I realized that I had never been able to see the palest stars with the center of my vision. No one has ever been able to, since, as we have seen, in that area is the fovea that lacks rods and it's unable to see the palest lights. You can see that by yourself. You just have to look at the less bright stars in the firmament, right with the center of your vision. But hey, enough chatter, because we were talking about megapixels. We could say that the combination of the fovea and the rest of the cornea capture images of 8 megapixels. To put it into perspective, the iPhone 14 takes pictures of 12 megapixels. Every second, your eye sends about 45 images of these to your brain. Remember the FPS. Here's where this organ comes into play, which does a very convoluted post-processing of the images that deceive us, making us think that we're seeing a continuous image, without being able to realize that in reality these are photos that our eyes are sending us. It also creates a false sensation of homogeneous resolution, filling in the gaps of information outside the fovea. Another incredible example of our brain making up information is the stopped clock illusion. Have you ever noticed that in class or at work, when you see the wall clock or your wristwatch to see how much time is left, and you notice that the first second lasted a little longer than the rest, it was longer? This happens because when you move your eyes from one place to another, while the movement occurs, we capture very blurry images that if you try to remember, you can't. This is because your brain deletes them and fills that information gap with the first still image that it sees, the first second of the clock. It literally creates a false memory that is implanted in your brain and that would correspond to your eyes moving from one place to another. This false memory lasts less than a second, which may seem like an insignificant time. But if you live 70 years, these moments will end up adding up approximately to 2 years. 2 years of lost information from invented memories. It's fascinating. I'm also sure that you didn't remember that you're looking at your nose. Yes, it's always in your field of view, bothering you. But until I told you, you were unaware of its presence. And this is because your brain considers it completely irrelevant information. So it suppresses it. Poor nose. But your brain cannot always fill these information gaps. If the FPS are too low, you will end up noticing. Look at this fluorescent lamp. As you see, it shines continuously. Or maybe not. This is the same lamp, but recorded in slow motion. As you see, it doesn't emit continuous light. It constantly turns on and off. This happens because this lamp has a frequency of 60 Hz. That is to say, it turns on and off 60 times per second, 60 FPS. So unless you're an extremely trained military pilot that could see more than 60 FPS, your brain would simply not notice. It assumes that there is only light, when in reality there is also darkness. These fluorescent lamps are designed to operate at 60 Hz because, as we've seen before, it's the maximum frequency that most human beings can perceive and distinguish. This effect has a name, and it's called flicker effect. And since fluorescent lights are used so much in today's world, the flicker effect has a very curious consequence. When we are indoors with the lights on, in reality, without realizing, we're witnessing thousands of flickerings per minute without even being able to see them. But don't stress out. And what if we keep going down? Well, something very interesting happens. If the frequency of the light drops from 30 FPS to like 50, for example, the brain realizes that something is happening there. There is darkness during which it does not receive information. It is receiving half the information in the same amount of time, which can cause another illusion, that the time passes more slowly. It is possible that if you have ever been to a nightclub or a light art exhibition, you have probably experienced this curious effect. A dark room full of people with a single light blinking at a low frequency. Time will pass at the same speed, but it will give you the illusion that everything is happening in slow motion. It will give you the illusion that you have more time to think what you're doing, that the time around you is going slower than your brain. And it's normal, you're having the same time to process half the information. If you've never experienced it before, I recommend it. It's very curious. It is also something much deeper than just a fun illusion. Think about what I said, to feel that time goes in slow motion, because it raises a very interesting question. Is there a normal or standard time speed for all organisms? Is a second the same for you as for a fly? Do all organisms have the same perception of time? Well, no. Because that's something that depends on the flow of information, on the amount of data that reaches the brain at each instance of time, and how much it is capable of processing. And this has been demonstrated by science. The smallest animals are the ones that can process the most FPS, given that they have evolved to be able to process more information per unit of time, while the largest of us miss many details. And why is this? Well, there are two reasons. In first place, because they can. The smaller an organism is, the faster metabolism it has. It needs it because otherwise it would freeze to death. Because the smaller an organism is, the faster it loses its temperature. They need to generate a lot of energy constantly. That's why the smallest animals have hearts that beat so fast. And they eat so much for their weight. They need to have their cells at full throttle. This makes everything go faster for them. Their muscles, their neurons, their cones and rods of their eyes have more energy to work. This allows them to process information more quickly. And the second reason is because it's what natural selection has favored. With a few exceptions, the smaller you are, the more predators you have. So you need to be more aware of your surroundings and be more agile. Have a faster perception of time and a faster metabolism. A fly will always have a bird stalking it, while an elephant will look at the bird with indifference. Why do you think it's so difficult to catch a fly or a mosquito? It's not because you're clumsy, it's that their perception of time is different. Fruit flies can perceive and process up to 4 times more FPS than us. For them, you move in slow motion. While you are raising your arm, they have processed that they need to flee, and their very fast metabolism allows them to do it faster than what it will take you to change the direction of your arm. So, indeed, time is not the same for everyone. Even between people, although it is very subtle, we experience it differently. In the end, it all comes down to how fast we're able to process information. So then, without senses, time wouldn't exist. Or would it? Let's imagine the case of a person or organism that is born without senses. Difficult, but not impossible. It would be alone with its brain, with its consciousness. Could that person quantify time? That would be difficult because it wouldn't have stimuli, it wouldn't have information to process. After birth, its life would seem infinite, eternal, until the day of its death. Each moment of its life would seem to it at the same time, infinite and ephemeral. This is very important because it shows that the time that we experience is actually something that our brain creates. An illusion, a unique experience of each individual. The real time of the universe, that thing that is relative depending on the speed and gravity that you experience, the seconds that the clock show, is something completely different. Real time, for lack of a better term, goes at 5.4 by 10 raised to the 44th FPS. Not bad. Let's see when YouTube oversaws this quality. Although in reality, no living being could process this amount of images per second, no matter how evolved they are. Because this FPS, this amount of time, is what is known as the Planck time, the minimum unit of time that can be measured, the smallest unit of time that the laws of the universe allow. It's defined as the time that a photon takes to travel the Planck length, the minimum possible distance in the universe, what we could metaphorically call the pixels of reality. Smaller timescales simply cannot be measured by anything in the cosmos. And if something cannot be measured, does it exist? That is a philosophical debate that we don't have time to explain. But what about time, which surely exists, the one above this scale? What is real time? What a question. More than 2,000 years ago, Aristotle already said that time is the most unknown of all that we don't know. 2 millennia later, things have not changed much. The actual definition of time that physicists have is what a clock reads. That's it. I'm sorry if I disappointed you, but the truth is that we have no idea of the nature of time. It is a concept that, at the moment, is completely abstract to us. But these more than 2,000 years that have passed have not been in vain. We have been finding clues of what it could be. There are the so-called arrows of time that give us clues about their direction. We have discovered 8 arrows, but here are the 3 easiest to understand. The physiological, responsible for the fact that you can remember the past but not the future. The thermodynamic, responsible for the energy of the universe being increasingly diluted. And the cosmological one, responsible for the expansion of the universe. These 3 conjectures that may seem very obvious are not irrelevant, because they denote an asymmetry. That is, that the future and the past are different. If they were symmetrical, the universe of 1,000 years ago could be identical to today. But this is impossible. It does not happen. And not because it is very unlikely. The probability is 0. There are configurations, arrangements of atoms on enormous scales that will never repeat because the necessary conditions can no longer be met. Given that we have advanced in time, the second law of thermodynamics requires that in each passing second, there is less useful energy in the cosmos. Each day we advance towards a higher entropy state of more used energy. We advance in a direction of time. And you can observe this law at home. Put an ice cube in a glass of water. The cube will always dissolve, and an ice cube in the glass will never form unless you spend energy. unless you put it in the freezer. There are countless examples of things that when we see them cause an alarm in our brain that a few days after birth has already learned the second law of thermodynamics. When they teach us that in physics class, it's just a reminder that the disorder of the universe is always increasing, and reducing disorder locally will waste energy, contributing even more to that disorder. The same thing happens with our perception of time, which is perhaps the most obvious one. We don't remember the future because it hasn't happened yet. We're going towards it. With the expansion of the universe, the same. Every day, there is more space-time in the universe. We will never be able to return to a previous state of less space-time. Wait a moment. Space-time? Are space and time the same thing? No, but they are part of the same thing. Of that thing whose nature we don't know, but we know well how it behaves. That's why time is considered one more dimension. And that's why Einstein's general relativity is wonderful. Because by uniting time and space, you can explain phenomena related to time that could seem like magic. Satellite clocks, for example, have to be programmed to go slower than ours because time passes faster for them. We have verified it experimentally thousands of times. And what's the only difference between a satellite and you? Well, that you're closer to the gravitational well of the Earth, at a different point in space. But what is affected is time. Here you have it. Time is one more dimension that goes hand in hand with spatial dimensions, and this have very relevant implications. Before, we saw how each living being perceives time differently, but I lied. You not only perceive it, you also experience it, like the satellites. Real time also passes differently for each living being in this universe because it depends on the space it occupies and its speed. A time that also has its FPS, the Planck time. So we're nothing more than discontinuous entities in space-time. Small, temporary and ephemeral slices that exist in time intervals within the duration of 5.4 times 10 to the power of minus 44 seconds. We're all going in the same direction, but at different speeds, through something that perhaps we'll never know what it is beyond noticing its effects. In the same way that a fly feels the heat of the sun, but its level of comprehension is so low that it will never understand what a star is. We feel the passage of time, but it's possible that we're not ready to understand its nature. Although, to be able to know our limits, we first have to reach it. Let's be cosmological pilots. Let's not settle at 45 FPS, because I'm sure that we're capable of much more. Thank you very much for watching the video, and goodbye.